I'd like to welcome everyone to the penultimate of our series of exhibition talks connected with the Time and Cosmos exhibition. If you haven't seen me before here, I'm Alexander Jones. I was the curator of the Time and Cosmos exhibition. I'm also currently the interim director of ISAW. And each of these lectures has been a special pleasure for me because each lecturer has been someone I know very well through my interests in various aspects of ancient science and things relating to science. Tonight, the story begins a little over 10 years ago when I got a letter asking from Germany, from the University of Münster, asking me if I would be willing to act as a reader for a dissertation on the subject of the horoscope of Hadrian. Now, I'm not really an expert on ancient astrology, but I was aware of this horoscope of Hadrian. It's about 4 pages. I thought this would be a fairly light task even for a sort of amateur in the field. A couple of weeks later, this arrived in the mail. So it was a bit harder work than I had been counting on, but very rewarding. I mean, in the dissertation form, which after about a decade is now available as a magisterial book, this is not just a study of 4 or 5 pages of a particular emperor's horoscope, but what is really almost an encapsulation within pretty massive book, but still of a huge amount of information about how Greco-Roman astrology worked, about who the authors were, about their various different doctrines and things, all organized in a very coherent way so that although it is large, it is easy to navigate and hugely instructive, very accurate, very up-to-date, and we really needed something like this because the last time someone did sort of general treatment of Greco-Roman astrology was in the late 19th century before most of the key publications of texts happened. So we're very happy to have this. Anyway, over the past decade, I've come to know Stephan very well. He is a wonderful person as well as a wonderful scholar. He is a specialist in 2 areas which are rather rarely done among classical scholars. One is the history of Greco-Roman astrology. The other is Neo-Latin literature. That is the Latin literature written by Europeans after the Middle Ages. And he sometimes manages to combine the 2 by working on astrological texts written in the Neo-Latin period as well. Anyway, he was the natural choice for an author for the chapter of our exhibition catalog on the astrological objects and the practice of horoscopy in antiquity that is illustrated in the exhibition. And so I'm thrilled to have him here to talk about this aspect of the exhibition and the parts of ancient society and astrology that they connect with.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this really kind introduction. I'm sort of overwhelmed to see such a huge audience and so many interested people for my lecture tonight. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm particularly delighted that my friend and colleague Dorian Greenbaum, who is co-author with me of Chapter 5 of the exhibition catalog, is also joining us tonight. My lecture will fall into 2 parts. First, an introduction to the historical development and the main characteristics of ancient astrology, and then a survey of the importance of timekeeping in the practice of horoscopy. Astrology, as we think of it, originated as an amalgam of science, religion, myth, and philosophy in Egypt during the last 2 centuries BC. In that period, Egypt was ruled by a Greek-speaking dynasty, and many Greeks lived in Egypt. Therefore, it is customary to speak of Hellenistic Egypt. The astrology that originated on the shores of the Nile drew on contributions from various cultures. It was from Mesopotamia that the Hellenistic astrologers adopted the concept of the abstract 360-degree zodiac with its 12 constellations, arithmetical procedures for the computation of rising times of the zodiacal signs, the idea of an individual chart, and a very small number of strictly astrological tenets. Indigenous Egyptian elements of Hellenistic astrology are the 36 decans and the ascendant, an Egyptian zodiac called Dodekahoros, and probably also the subdivision of the chart into 12 so-called places. I shall explain these contributions shortly. Genuinely Greek elements are the myths associated with the planetary deities, as well as borrowings from Greek astronomy and cosmology, physics, geometry, and philosophy. In compliance with Stoic cosmology, the Hellenistic astrologers posit the cosmos as a spherical, animated organism in which all parts are related to each other by universal sympathy, as they call it. Thus, the human body was seen as a microcosm, a tiny image of the macrocosm, which is the universe. It was taken for granted that whatever affects the parts of the macrocosm is necessarily and predictably reflected in the parts of the human microcosm. Hellenistic astrology spread quickly from Egypt throughout the Mediterranean world and flourished through the end of antiquity. Unlike in contemporary Western societies, Hellenistic astrology deeply pervaded and affected many fields of life in the cultures of the Roman Empire. The astrological texts are mostly written in Greek, but partly also in Latin and in the Egyptian language. Astrology covers a variety of prognostic fields. I shall concentrate on the second and fourth on this list: individual birth astrology and elections, that is, the choice of the best time for an action. The importance of timekeeping becomes clear when we take a look at the most important innovation of Hellenistic astrology compared to its Mesopotamian precursor, namely the ascendant, which has no counterpart in the cuneiform record. The ascendant is the part of the zodiac that is rising on the eastern horizon at the time of an individual's birth. This diagram takes the perspective of a human observer on Earth who is facing south. To this observer, the zodiac will appear to rotate clockwise once within 24 hours around the place of observation. Each of the 12 zodiacal signs takes about 2 hours to rise, each single degree 4 minutes. Therefore, if the rising part of the zodiac is important for astrological computations and predictions, it must be determined accurately. The concept of the ascendant grew out of an indigenous Egyptian tradition of timekeeping at night. From oldest Egyptian times, the fixed stars along the ecliptic were grouped into 36 relatively small constellations. These were observed at night as they either crossed the horizon or made their transits through the midheaven. Each decan needs about 40 minutes to rise or to cross the midheaven. After the introduction of the Mesopotamian zodiac into Egypt, the two concepts were soon combined. Each zodiacal sign would now comprise 3 decans. In the Egyptian tradition, however, these decans were not only material clusters of fixed stars, but at the same time deities. The concept of the astrological ascendant thus grew out of the idea that at any given time of day or night, when a child is born, one of the 36 gods is rising in the east, watching the event and exercising its particular influence on the new human life in the moment of its beginning. It did not take long until the concept of the ascendant was emancipated from the decans and refined to even smaller units of time based on the rising of single zodiacal degrees, which you see here marked on the zodiac ring, or even, in rare cases, refinement to minutes of degrees, 1 minute being the 60th part of a degree. It will be enough to mention one of the various arguments that prompted this increasing pursuit of accuracy, namely the famous twin argument. How can twins have different fates if their births occur not only in the same place and from the same mother, but on top of that, more or less simultaneously? This argument was advanced by critics of astrology such as Cicero and the church father Augustine. The astrologers replied that the heavens move at such speed that even a tiny interval of time, such as that separating the births of twins, makes a momentous difference to the planetary positions within the zodiac and with respect to the horizon. It was for this and similar reasons that Claudius Ptolemy, the greatest ancient astronomer and at the same time author of an influential treatise on astrology, advocated chronological accuracy to the single minute of time in horoscopic practice, although he admits that he is aware that such accuracy was technically impossible with the usual ancient devices for timekeeping, namely the sundial and the water clock. However, since Ptolemy's voice is a theoretical and rather isolated one, it will be useful to take a look at how precisely time was actually determined in the extant record of practical applications. We have a total of 345 horoscopes in ancient Greek language. This is, of course, but a tiny percentage of those countless horoscopes that were actually cast in the Roman Empire. Yet, this extant record is enough to allow us precious insights. Some 60% of these horoscopes come from documentary sources, that is, from papyri found in the sands of Egypt, while the other 40% are called literary horoscopes because they were included in ancient astrological manuals to illustrate various techniques. We also have 51 demotic horoscopes on potsherds and 6 Latin horoscopes. Among those, about 200 Greek and demotic documentary horoscopes on papyrus and potsherds, which are direct witnesses of astrological practice, the vast majority specifies the time of birth to the hour. This is not surprising if we consider that the astrologer would normally not be present at the time of birth, but rely on a date and time given to him by the client, who had no means of determining the time of birth more accurately than, at best, to the hour. Sometimes it is specified in these horoscopes that the time of birth was the beginning or the end of a certain hour. I know of only 2 ancient horoscopes that give the time of birth to the minute. One of them was found on a 3rd century papyrus in Oxyrhynchus, which specifies the birth time in a very unusual manner as 10 hours and 2 degrees of rising time after sunrise, that is in the late afternoon, and a very precise indication. The other one, which is still later from around about 500 CE, is a didactic horoscope cast by a professional mathematician, Eutychius of Ascalon. The authors of some other extant papyrus horoscopes claim independently of each other that they computed accurately. They all use the same Greek expression, ψεφίτζειν ακριβώς, to compute accurately, and they all compute planetary positions to the minute of arc, this small group which does so. This is a high level of precision which would satisfy modern astrologers too. Ancient standard precision in horoscopic practice is to give longitudes to the full zodiacal sign. Precision to the minute of arc can also be found in some 20 papyrus horoscopes which do not explicitly claim accuracy. All this seems to indicate that there was, over a time span of several centuries, a discourse on the importance of chronological and astronomical accuracy in the astrological community and beyond. Two of these horoscopes that specify planetary longitudes to the minute of arc are on display in the exhibition. They are particularly interesting cases. Both of them were cast in the 2nd century CE, supposedly in Thebes in Egypt. And for the same individual, a certain Anubion, born in 137 CE. It seems that the upper papyrus on this slide was written first by one astrologer, and that the client asked later a second opinion from another astrologer, because the lower papyrus gives a different text that is not only much more elaborate, but presents astronomical data of higher quality. Interestingly, both texts contain serious grammatical mistakes which indicate that they were not written by native speakers of Greek, but by imperfectly Hellenized indigenous Egyptians, maybe by gentlemen like this contemporary priest of Serapis, who was probably an astrologer. We know that Egyptian temples played an important role in the development and practice of Hellenistic astrology. Moreover, Thebes was an old religious center of Egypt. The earlier horoscope is preserved completely. In the first 5 lines, it mentions the individual's name, his birth date, expressed both in the Roman and the Egyptian calendar, and the time of day, namely the beginning of the first hour of day. That means right after sunrise. The text then specifies the longitudes of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets to the minute of arc, in each case adding a mix of other relevant data. Modern recomputation reveals that the agreement of the astronomical longitudes and the calendrical date is fair. Last, the 4 cardinal points, 2 different astrological lots of fortune, and the ruler of the nativity, Venus, are specified. The second analysis by a different astrologer must have been significantly longer than the first one. Regrettably, only its beginning is preserved. The author introduces his text with interesting references to the authorities on whose books his analysis will be based. These authorities are partly historical, partly legendary human individuals from Babylonia and Mesopotamia, as well as tutelary deities of astrology. Then comes the calendrical date, both Roman and Egyptian, the time of day, namely the first hour of day, and eventually an elaborate discussion of what the author calls the 7 gods, that is, the 7 planetary deities, sun, moon, and the 5 real planets. The section devoted to the sun is extant, with all its astronomical and astrological details. Then the text becomes too fragmentary to be intelligible. Interestingly, the sun's position in Sagittarius is, for the day and time in question, clearly better in this papyrus than in the previous version. The computation of planetary longitudes to the minute of arc, which we find in both horoscopes here, implies a claim to high chronological accuracy, especially with regard to the moon, which moves 1 minute of arc in less than 2 minutes of time. A similar claim for accuracy is implied in specifying the ascendant to the degree, as the first papyrus does. In the second papyrus, that section is missing. Because each degree of the zodiac takes but a few minutes to rise. Since the first version of Anubion's horoscope is completely preserved, it is clear that its author did the same as what we find in almost all papyrus horoscopes, namely that they contain only the premise of an astrological interpretation, a set of data, but not the interpretation itself, which would be given orally. Both textual and archaeological evidence suggests that it was standard practice of ancient astrologers to illustrate the positions of the heavenly bodies and the ascendant during consultations with their clients by placing semi-precious stones as planetary markers on a rectangular board. Our exhibition features the two most important boards of this kind that are extant from antiquity. I shall first explain their structure of these boards and then the manner in which planetary markers were placed on them. Our first case is a serendipitous archaeological find that was made at the bottom of an ancient well near the village of Grand in northern France. That well belonged to a pagan sanctuary of Apollo. Actually, we find the find comprises two boards of almost identical make. This here, what you see on the slide, is one of the two boards, the one that is in the exhibition. Both boards were destroyed intentionally and with significant violence, probably by fanatic Christians in late antiquity, but they were successfully reconstructed by modern experts from almost 200 ivory fragments. Missing parts were supplemented in wood. This is the second board, the one that is not in the exhibition. So I shall focus for a minute on this one here in order to round off the picture that you get when visiting the exhibition. Originally, the two boards had been beautiful diptychs of almost identical make. They could fold like modern portable chessboards, and they were easy to transport. They apparently were produced around the same time in the 2nd century CE by the same workshop in Egypt, possibly from the same ivory tusk. The figures on the zodiacal signs and the decans were richly painted and gilded, as is clear from preserved traces of the colors. Parts of the silver hinges of the diptychs were found as well. The iconographical layout of each of the two boards has 5 circular registers. At the center are the busts of the sun god Helios and the moon goddess Selene, surrounded by 4 concentric rings that are equally divided by straight lines into 30-degree sections. Moving out from the center, the first ring features images of the 12 signs of the Hellenistic zodiac. The second ring, let's go back here. Yes. The second ring is very narrow and subdivided into small sections, the so-called planetary terms. These are an important parameter in the astrological interpretation of horoscopes. These terms have no astronomical foundation and are of uneven extension. The terms, excuse me please, therefore the respective amounts are indicated on the board by Greek number letters, as for example here in the sign of Gemini, whose terms are 6, 6, 5, 7, 6 degrees large. The third and largest ring features the 36 decan gods, 3 per sign, which are depicted as either human or animal-shaped figures standing or walking in upright positions. They are drawn in a clearly Egyptian style. The fourth and outermost ring, which is again narrow, like the second one, contains the Egyptian names of these decans in Greek letters. The 4 corners of the board are occupied by kneeling winged creatures representing the cardinal winds. Interspersed between them are a few stylized fixed stars. Fixed stars. The provenance of these typically Egyptian objects from an ancient site in northern France shows that by the 2nd century CE, Hellenistic astrology had permeated all parts of the Roman Empire. The second astrological board in the exhibition is the so-called tabula bianchini, that is the board discovered by the astronomer Francesco Bianchini. It is in various respects different from the ivory tablets from Grand. The present board here was a large square marble slab, presumably a rare luxury object. The extant fragments were found in Rome in 1705. Regrettably, 2/3 of the board is lost. The authentic parts are in the upper left part and in the lower center of the slide. It is, however, almost certain that the top right-hand corner can be restored thanks to a drawing of a now lost fragment by a 17th century scholar. The tabula bianchini features 5 concentric rings that are, like the 4 rings of the ivory boards from Grand, equally divided by straight lines into 30-degree sections. The inner circle is here occupied by drawings of the 2 celestial bears and the polar dragon. The first ring around this center is occupied by the 12 animals of the Dodekahoros, a kind of Egyptian zodiac which consists of a cat, dog, serpent or snake, scarab beetle, ass, lion, goat, bull, falcon, baboon or ape, ibis, and crocodile. The most likely explanation of this Dodekauros is that it visualizes the 12 metamorphoses of the sun god in the 12 double hours of the day. The second and the third circles are occupied by 2 iconographically identical versions of the Hellenistic zodiac. They were identical as far as we can judge from the extant fragments. On the 4th ring, which is very narrow, the amounts of the planetary terms are again marked with Greek number letters. The 5th and outermost ring houses the 36 decan gods. Above each decan is a round medallion featuring the bust of its ruling planetary deity. Above Aries and Taurus, and moving counterclockwise, we find Mars, the sun god, and Venus, then Mercury, the moon goddess, and Saturn. These planetary rulers are absent from the small ivory boards from Grand, as is the Dodekauros on the innermost ring of the tabula bianchini here. The 4 corners of the board were occupied by winged busts of the cardinal winds. Only the east wind is preserved on the marble fragment. This board probably served the same purpose as the ivory boards from Grand, namely to illustrate planetary alignments in astrological contexts. It is therefore most likely that it was placed in a flat manner in antiquity in order to be used. Otherwise, the planetary markers would fall off. I say this because in the exhibition it is installed in a vertical manner, which makes it all the better visible and easier to examine to the visitor, but in antiquity it was flat. A third horoscope board is regrettably not preserved in the original marble, but only through a squeeze made by Georges d'Arécy a century ago. A squeeze is an imprint or mold of the original object. This board was a square marble plate from the Roman imperial period. Like the ivory boards from Grand, it features busts of the sun god and the moon goddess at the center with 2 rings around them. The inner one is devoted to the dodecahedron, the outer to the Hellenistic zodiac. This board does not have circles for the decans and for the planetary terms. I have brought a little replica of this object, and I would ask you to pass it on, avoiding breakage. I did not manage to have the zodiac figures engraved as on the original, but at least this gives you an impression of the exact dimensions and the weight and what the typical tool of an ancient astrologer, what it was like. And then planetary markers in semi-precious stones would be placed on top of that. As is evident from these 3 examples, ancient horoscopic boards combined with different levels of completeness various available frames of reference, such as the Hellenistic zodiac, the decans, terms, etc., to describe the time and the cosmic configuration of an astrologically relevant moment, such as birth. Now, which markers would an ancient astrologer employ to visualize the planetary alignment of a given moment in time for his client? We have only 2 relevant texts from antiquity which speak of different stones. Since one of these texts is a novel, the so-called Alexander Romans, in which a horoscope board is used by a king who employs unusually precious stones, I shall follow the other text, which contains instructions for the use of planetary markers in everyday astrological practice. The text is a fragmentary papyrus from about 200 CE that says, quote, "Let the stars be set upon the board as they are by nature, except for the sun and moon. And let the sun be golden, the moon gold. The moon silver, Saturn of obsidian, Mars of reddish onyx, Venus lapis lazuli, veined with gold, Mercury turquoise. Let Jupiter be of stone like air, almost crystalline. And the horoscope," then the text becomes very fragmentary, "let it lie," and somehow boxwood is mentioned. I have created sample markers in imitation of the relevant stones as best I could. The last instruction is unclear. It looks as if the ascendant was associated with boxwood. This would make sense in view of the frequent ancient metaphor for the ascendant, radar, combined with the fact that boxwood is a particularly hard kind of wood that was often used by ancient shipbuilders. Moreover, boxwood has a distinctive yellowish color. Please note that 2 nuances of the same color, namely blue, are here reserved to Mercury and Venus, maybe because these planets have in common that they always stay near the sun from the perspective of an earthly observer, unlike the other planets. Let us now place these markers accordingly on one of our boards to visualize the planetary alignment at Anubion's birth, as described in the papyri that we saw before. I have chosen the outer zodiac ring of the Tabula Bianchini. So here we have the tabula bianchini, and these would be the positions of the 8 markers for the positions given in the horoscope of Anubion. The problem now is, in one way, there's a pointer, that this here in the boxwood color indicates the ascendant. So we need to turn the board. This is the invisible part of the cosmos beneath the horizon. This is the visible part of the world, so we must turn this around in order to see, to have the board in the correct position that visualizes the alignment of the planets at the time of birth of this Anubion. So this part would be above the horizon with these constellations and decans and everything, and this is beneath the horizon. So based on this visualization, the astrologer would now provide his client with an oral interpretation of the positions of the 7 planetary deities and the ascendant. He would do so in 3 major respects. Firstly, with regard to the zodiac signs, including the so-called planetary dignities, such as terms, houses, exaltations, triplicities, etc. Secondly, with regard to each other, for instance, he would point out the conjunction of the Sun with Mercury and Venus, here the conjunction of the Moon with Saturn, but not with Mars, because Mars is very close, but in a different zodiacal sign. He would point out aspects, similar geometrical relationships. And thirdly, he would point out the importance of the data with regard to the horizon of the human observer, namely that only the Sun and its 2 satellites were in the process of rising, while the other planets are beneath the Earth here. This becomes particularly interesting, this board here, when we investigate the use of the 2 zodiac rings. One may wonder why 2 times the Hellenistic zodiac, but one important field of application in ancient practice was to compare the horoscopes of 2 individuals. For instance, when a marriage was being planned and arranged, it might be important, and it was very frequently done, to compare the horoscope of the prospective husband and that of the prospective wife. So if we add a fictitious horoscope of a young woman here on the inner circle, you see now we have 2 planetary markers of each kind. The inner ring is now reserved to the woman's horoscope, the outer one to Anubion's horoscope. And for such a marriage, for instance, it is important from the ancient astrologer's point of view that the sun of the female horoscope, which symbolizes the husband, is that it be in harmonious aspect with the moon of the woman. And vice versa. So we have here the moon of the husband that indicates the wife in harmonious, namely trine aspect with the sun of the woman, and vice versa between the sun and the moon. So such kinds of analyses could be done on a board with 2 zodiac rings. You may, of course, wonder if any authentic ancient planetary markers are preserved. Regrettably, our archaeological record does not include any object that can with certainty be identified as such a marker. It is, however, possible that engraved semi-precious stones, such as those on display in the exhibition, were used to mark planets and the ascendant on horoscope boards. The exhibited gems fall into 2 groups: planetary deities, including sun and moon, and zodiac signs. I shall very briefly review them one by one. Since the gems are small, measuring between ½ an inch and little more than 1 inch, I shall enlarge them so that you can easily discern the details. In the first group of objects, we find this carnelian ringstone featuring Saturn wearing a beard and a priestly veil. This carnelian features Jupiter seated on a stool, holding 2 grain ears and a scepter. This sardonyx features Mars wearing a helmet, holding a spear in his left hand and a shield in his right. This red and green jasper intaglio features the sun god standing in his 4-horse chariot. On this very pale amethyst, we see Venus as the goddess of victory, leaning on a column, holding a spear in her right hand and a sword in her left. A small Cupid to her left is offering her a helmet. This yellow beryl and topaz features Mercury holding his herald's staff and a typical ancient garment. This convex brown paste in imitation of a sard features the moon goddess holding a torch with a crescent on her head and driving a 2-horse chariot. The last 2 objects in this group are special cases. This one is an amethyst featuring the goddess of fortune, holding a cornucopia and rudder. This goddess does not represent a planet, but may be meant to represent the astrological lot of fortune, an important point in ancient horoscopes that is calculated from the longitudes of sun, moon, and ascendant. The other special case in this is this carnelian featuring a rudder. Since Greco-Roman texts employ on various occasions the metaphor of a rudder to denote the ascendant, this gem may belong in an astrological context. Regarding the second group of gems, only a selection of the 12 zodiac constellations are on display in the exhibition. This light orange translucent carnelian features Aries. This red-orange carnelian features the twins, Castor and Pollux, who face each other, each holding an inverted spear with stars over their heads, indicating that they are the constellation Gemini. Here we have a brown and gray banded agate featuring Cancer. A red-orange jasper featuring Leo with a star and a lunar crescent above, and a brown glass paste featuring Capricorn with a rudder and a globe. One may wonder whether the latter image meant that Capricorn was the ascendant sign for the owner, especially since other ancient gems are extant on which the iconographical elements of a zodiacal figure and a rudder are combined. In addition to these objects, a second Leo gem deserves special attention. This heliotrope is unusual in showing individual stars that apparently represent actual stars in the constellation, not just a star as a generic symbol, indicating that the figure is meant as a constellation. Clearly discernible is the bright fixed star on the lion's chest, as well as other bright stars above and around the animal's head and on the tip of its tail. While the gems with planetary or ascendant iconography might have been used to visualize cosmic alignments on horoscopic boards of the type that we saw, the other group of gems with zodiacal sign imagery cannot have been combined with the boards that we saw. Nevertheless, they illustrate the popularity of such objects for ornamental or other purposes, which presumably reflects the diffusion of astrological practice. For example, it is possible that someone had that zodiacal sign engraved on a gem in which the ascendant or the moon had been at his or her birth. In rare cases, gems feature entire horoscopes, as is the case with this yellow jasper, whose planetary alignment is datable to 11 September 195 CE. On the obverse, we find the moon goddess in Taurus, Jupiter in Aquarius, the sun god in Virgo, and the winged head of Mercury in Leo. On the reverse, we find the goddess of fortune reclining on a couch, Saturn in Capricorn, and Mars and Venus in Libra. Another rare artistic manner of representing the relationship between one's individual birth time and the surrounding cosmos is extant on this golden seal ring from Syria. 8 of the altogether 9 sections of this ring are engraved with the astronomical date of a planetary alignment that can be dated to August 17, 327 CE at about 4 a.m. The data are given as triplets in abbreviated Greek words and letter numbers. For example, Helios, Leontos, Moirais, Kappa Gamma, meaning Sun 23 degrees Leo, or Horoscopos, Carcinu, Moirais, Iota, ascendant in 10 degrees of Cancer. In the same manner, each triplet specifies first the heavenly body, then the zodiacal sign that it happened to occupy during the owner's nativity, and finally the degree of arc within that sign. Professor Jones has shown that this is the earliest known application of Ptolemy's astronomy to a horoscope. Hence, it is not only aesthetically beautiful, but also high-tech. On the 8th side of the ring, a seal is mounted, featuring a bust of the ancient Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, with his well-known rod on the left side, and the Greek word hygia, health, on the right side. Left and right would, of course, be reversed in the imprint of this seal. One may conjecture that this ring belonged to a rich physician who used his horoscope to adorn the seal ring, an object that served to assert his identity. My conjecture that the owner was a physician is corroborated, yet beyond proof, by the fact that astrology and medicine were throughout antiquity considered to be empirical sister sciences. They overlap in the field of medical astrology, so-called iatromathematics, and in many cases, astrology and medicine were practiced by one and the same individual. Up to this point, my lecture has concentrated on birth horoscopes. In the remaining minutes, I should like to address 2 other branches of astrology which equally build on a precise moment in time and its relation to the cosmos, namely medical astrology and elections. In medical astrology, the planetary alignment to be analyzed is that of the decumbiture, decubitus in Latin, that is, the day and time when the patient has fallen ill and took to his or her bed. The position of the moon at that time was deemed to be of paramount importance because the moon is the astrological symbol of the body and of biological functions. Both its position in the zodiac and its geometrical relations to the other planets were examined in order to make predictions regarding the cause, the seriousness, the appropriate therapy, the duration, and the outcome of an illness. If, for example, someone had fallen ill at the same time when our friend Anubion was born, the astrologer-physician would certainly not have appreciated the fact that Saturn and the moon are, according to the text of our papyrus, both in the 4th degree of Aquarius, that is, in close conjunction, and on top of that, in the zodiac house of the malefic Saturn. Saturn is a malefic in conjunction with the moon in his own house. Therefore, Saturn is very strong. If another person fell ill just a few hours later, the situation would be even worse, because by that time Mars would have moved into Aquarius, thus joining the detrimental conjunction. When surgery was needed, we find a connection between medical astrology and elections. In many contexts of ancient life, time-related decisions had to be made, and some of these decisions involved obvious major risks that people wished to minimize. The best time for a surgery could be the object of such an astrological election chosen by the astrologer or astrologer physician. But there were many other situations in everyday life that might require an astrological election, such as voyages by ship, especially to destinations that required a route over high seas. These were notoriously dangerous because reliable meteorological forecasts did not exist. And ancient ships were structurally less safe than modern vessels. Astrologers claimed to be able to determine the best date for safe travels, or in other contexts, the best date for a marriage, for laying the foundations of a house, and so forth. In order to make such an election, they would choose the best time for the event's success by consulting astronomical tables to determine when the astrological factors relevant to the election were in operation, and give the client the day and time that those would occur. The horoscope could then be visualized and explained on an astrological board like a nativity. A simpler method of choosing the best time for an action, which did not require an election horoscope but could be combined with one, was based on time rulership. As we shall see, this doctrine is the origin of our 7-day week. And this is my last point. In a few minutes, I shall come to the conclusion. As we shall see, this doctrine is the origin of our 7-day week. I shall first briefly explain the chronological structure of this doctrine and then its astrological function. Each hour of the day is assigned a specific planet according to the sequence of the planetary spheres in the ancient geocentric universe, starting from the outermost sphere, that of Saturn, and moving down to the sphere of the moon. This descending order was the rule in ancient enumerations of the planets. Thus, the first hour of the first day is ruled by Saturn, the second by Jupiter, the third by Mars, and so on until the 7th hour is ruled by the moon. Then the series starts over with Saturn ruling the 8th hour, and so on. The 24th hour will thus be ruled by Mars, which means that the next following planet, the Sun, will rule the first hour of the next day. Whoever rules the first hour is automatically also ruler of the entire day. This is why the first day of the week is Saturday, the next day Sunday, and so on. It takes 7 days until the series starts over, because the last hour of the day of Venus is ruled by the moon, which has the lowest sphere in the geocentric universe. Therefore, the first hour of the 8th day will again be ruled by Saturn, thus initiating a new week. While the first 3 days of the week preserve in English the names of the presiding planetary deities, Saturn, Sun, and Moon, the following 4 are named after the Germanic equivalents of Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. This astrological doctrine is attested from the late 1st century BC onwards. It claims that the success or failure of any human undertaking will depend on the qualities of its presiding two rulers, the day ruler and its deputy, the hour ruler. Jupiter and Venus are considered to be benefic deities, Saturn and Mars malefic, the remaining three ambivalent. I have here chosen a 7-hour interval from Friday to illustrate these qualities. Hence, if one wishes, for example, to choose a propitious date for a marriage, the best possible hour of the entire week is on Friday afternoon, when Venus is both day ruler and hour ruler, while hours ruled by Saturn and or Mars would be disastrous, literally. What matters for our purposes is the close succession of good and bad hours in this system. In particular, every hour of benefic Jupiter is flanked by 2 hours of the malefics Saturn and Mars. This obviously requires accurate timekeeping for those who believe in time rulership. Thanks to a serendipitous archaeological find, the same Friday morning situation of astrological time rulership is preserved on this fragment of an inscription from around 100 CE. The black line here indicates, this is a drawing of the inscription, not a photograph, of course, and the black line indicates the fragment that is really preserved, while all the rest has been supplied by the editors of this inscription. And the various hours on this inscription are marked with the letters B, C, and N, meaning a bona, a good hour, an ambivalent hour, or a noxious, bad hour. For example, the 7th hour is ruled by the sun god, Sol, and marked C for communis, that is ambivalent. This inscription was found in the ruins of Potentia, a small city on the Adriatic coast in Italy. We may safely assume that it comprised all 7 days of the week before it broke into fragments. This inscription is important both because of its early date and because of its epigraphic nature, which implies a bigger technical and financial effort than just copying the data by hand on papyrus, for instance. It is probable, yet beyond proof, that this inscription was on public display for the benefit of the citizens of Potentia. Apart from the election of propitious hours for whatever kind of action, the doctrine of time rulership was also, but less frequently, used to make predictions regarding the lives of newborn children, depending on their day and hour of birth. One of several ancient texts on this topic is the so-called calendar of the year 354 CE, which contains these illustrations for the single weekdays. Regrettably, the last 2 are missing. Each of them informs us in the upper register about the qualities of the hour rulers and in the lower register about their astrological effects. Let us take a very quick look at the first day of the week, Saturday. On the right side, you see the 12 hours of the day marked with the usual letters B, C, and N. On the left, we find the 12 hours of the preceding night. The lower register says, I translate, when it is Saturn's day and hour, either nocturnal or diurnal, everything becomes dark and toilsome. Those who are born during such an hour will be endangered. A slave who ran away at that time will not be found. Who has fallen ill then will be endangered. An object that was then stolen will not be found. In comparison, the entry for Monday says that the hours which are ruled by the moon are useful for bringing dung on the fields and for building wells and cisterns. Those who are born will be vital, a runaway slave will be found, who has fallen ill will recover, stolen objects will be found. The historian Cassius Dio writes that at his time, around 200 CE, the astrological week had spread to all parts of the Roman Empire. This testifies to the enormous success of the astrological concept of time rulership, especially if we consider that other pre-existing concepts of time, such as the traditional 8-day week of the Romans, were suppressed by the new planetary week. Moreover, the Christian church fathers fought in vain against it, even after Christianity had become the state church of the Roman Empire. One could adduce more examples of the relationships of time and cosmos in Greco-Roman astrology, but I have focused on a selection that can be illustrated with archaeological remains, primarily, but not exclusively, those that are on display in the exhibition at this institute. In sum, it is legitimate to say that there was a strong belief among the peoples of the Roman Empire that the manifold vicissitudes of human life were influenced by the constantly changing alignments of the planets. In other words, that events in human lives were a cosmic function of time. I tend to think that astrology was also one reason for the introduction of timekeeping with accuracy down to the hour into everyday life. As a matter of fact, the use of the 24-hour day as a chronological frame of reference came into use during the last 2 centuries BCE, simultaneously with the rise of astrology. Thank you very much for your attention.